to not say too much about the Ukraine-Russia thing because I don't know enough.
Yeah.
And what I do know is that like 5 years ago, Zelensky was being touted as like the most corrupt leader in Europe. For whatever reason, I don't understand enough of it. It's like, it confuses me how he's become a hero. Obviously, it's because we don't want war. You know, Putin is not doing good things by invading. But I don't understand how he became the hero. And the other thing, the main thing I wanted to ask you actually about this, if we got to it, it's like, what is, like, you've spent time in Russia. Like, what is Putin's end game here? Because people say he's crazy. And I don't. I think that's a really bad way to look at it.
Yeah, no,
he's ex KGB, and you're never ex KGB, but he's a sharp operator, and I don't think he does anything without thinking that he's going to come out on top.
So in answer to your first point about Zelensky, Zelensky and the entire Ukrainian political system is very hard to understand if you haven't spent time next to it. Now, it is the Ukrainian political system is Ukraine is also very unequal, just like Russia, and or was before the war. I mean, there's so much property has been destroyed. Who knows now? And incredibly corrupt. So these clans battling for control. But unlike Russia, it's pluralistically corrupt. So there are different clans, regional clans. So a Donetsk clan, a Dnipro clan, Kyiv, Odessa, all of whom battle for control and battle for, all that. And so while it is corrupt, it's corrupt in a very different way to Russia. It's not got this pyramid of corruption with Putin at the top. And the reason for that is a very simple one, which is that it doesn't have the natural resources that Russia has. If you control the oil fields and the gas fields and, nickel in Russia, you kind of control everything. So you don't really need anything else. Whereas in Ukraine, because it doesn't have that, it's sort of a lot of agriculture, like chemicals, it's sort of heavy industry, agriculture, so on. It's much more difficult to control that as a pyramid. Like Yanukovych, the guy who was overthrown in 2014, tried to. And one of the reasons he failed is because he alienated so many of the other clans that they were prepared to stand by and allow him to be overthrown. So there are all questions between Zelensky's political allies, particularly this guy Kolomoisky, who was one of the big oligarchs in Ukraine. And there are many questions about that. With regard to what's happening, Zelensky is definitely, it's very cometh the hour, cometh the man moment. He has, redeemed himself spectacularly by his bravery in staying in his capital, despite the fact that, everyone thought that Kyiv would fall in days.
Yeah.
I mean, it is.
I've been stunned how long it's continued.
It's astonishingly brave thing to do. So I think, he deserves a lot of credit for that, undeniably. Though, we do wonder after the war, which hopefully will be soon, exactly what the fallout will be. But anyway, that's a different point. We don't need to talk about that. But with regard to Putin, he is ex-KGB, it's true, and the KGB didn't take fools. However, the KGB was a very large organization, and it had many different parts. And the very brightest people went into various bits. Now, he was also First Directorate, which is the foreign intelligence wing, their equivalent of MI6, because it was all sort of wrapped together into one thing, or the CIA. But he was posted to Dresden in East Germany. So he was posted to an under-prestigious place in a very under-prestigious country to be posted to. He wasn't, there are KGB people like his Sergei Ivanov, who's a close political ally, who was in New York for the KGB, or people who were in London. Those were like big postings. That's like you were the top of the tree if you got sent there. If you're sent to Dresden, that's a bit like being kind of an MI5 officer in Salisbury and Rhodesia in the 1970s. It's good, but it's not great. So, we shouldn't overestimate his sort of slyness and aptitude and cunning. And also, I just, like, on a pure human level, if you imagine that Tony Blair was still prime minister, right? So, I mean, Putin became prime minister in 99, Blair was in 97. It's not that different. If Blair was still prime minister, right? And since, say, about 2004-ish, had not had any political challenges of any kind, had no media scrutiny of any kind, had been essentially given anything materially that he wanted, right? Imagine what that would have done to his head. Imagine, I mean, even with the best will in the world, right? Even if you are the most dedicated, decent, public spirited person in the world, that is going to capsize your brain. You can't, the degree of sycophancy, the degree of, consumption, all of that, and just the lack of information. You need to be incredibly disciplined to maintain a sense of focus on what's really important. That's Putin. He has had no challenge, like, for almost 2 decades, really. And, everyone telling him what he wants to hear, everyone surrounding him with, bling, giving him what he wants. It's not easy to retain your sense of sort of what's important for that long. I'd say it's probably impossible. This is why presidential term limits are a good idea. And so I don't think he's crazy. No, he clearly isn't. I mean, you could see, how he acted in his early years of his time in office, when there was far more sort of media scrutiny of him and it's far easier to see what was happening. He was a rational actor who did, who took some really tough decisions. And I think had he stopped being president of Russia in 2008, history would remember him pretty kindly. But he couldn't, get off the tree or get off the horse.
Do you think he's become like a victim of the castle he's built himself?
Yeah, he's like Louis XVI. I mean, that's
interesting.
That's what I think. And so I think that, if Russia has a very, large intelligence industry. It had lots of people on the ground in Ukraine feeding back information and so on. But if essentially you were being rewarded for telling people what they wanted to hear, the incentives are just to, so I've no doubt that he thought that by sending troops into Ukraine, they would be welcomed with bread and salt, and in days it would be over and they'd be able to impose a different government and everything would be fine. I imagine in the worst case scenario, it would be like Budapest in 1956. There might be a bit of fighting in the capital and then it would be all over and it would be a fait accompli and everything would be fine. And I think this is the fruit of what happens when you have, a very out of touch politician at the top who's been flattered and told everything they want to hear. And, he is, I think, probably really, really, really struggling to deal with it.
And that is a perspective I have not heard from anyone. That is very interesting.
I mean, I can remember really clearly when I was living in Moscow. I used to go to the Kremlin quite often because, that was just part of the job being a journalist. And you'd wait for Putin. He was always late. And, you'd sit around and wait for him. And even then it felt like he had this cocooned existence. If you imagine, Tony Blair was giving, Boris Johnson was giving press conferences or press briefings and was just routinely 2 hours late, right? He would be ripped apart by the media, ripped apart. That was normal for Putin. 2 hours, 2.5 hours, whatever. You just sit around and wait. You'd go to sleep for a couple of hours. That was just normal for him. I can remember when he gave a speech. There was a conference about global warming, and so a couple of foreign politicians criticized Russia for not having joined this international effort to combat global warming called the Kyoto Protocol. And he responded as if he'd been sort of slapped in the face. He kind of got up, he was all kind of fury and bristling like a man in a pub who's, had someone knock his pint over. It was really unprofessional and weird. And I think, and that was, 15 years ago.
It's a little bit of Trump syndrome.
Yeah, I think
that sheltered existence.
Yeah, but more so because let's face it, people have been mocking Trump as long as Trump's been Trump. And Putin didn't. He doesn't have that. He's certainly not in. There was a guy. I think his name was Maxim Galkin, who was a Russian comedian. He was very funny, and he used to be on the kind of evening news program on a Sunday night. And he did this thing when it was all quite gentle, the satire, because by the sort of 2003-4, like, you didn't take the piss out of Putin really. But he did this thing Putin had done a speech with a note and with a page in his notebook, and he'd always turn the page of his notebook whenever he had to make a new point, and it was very noticeable. And Galkin did this whole thing of doing a speech, and then every time he turned the page, there'd be like a drum roll, like, and it was really funny, but it was pretty mild political commentary. It literally all he did was add essentially drum rolls. That was it, and he got sacked. That's it. How dare you bring drum rolls to a reference to our dear leader?
You could consider that to be a compliment.
Yeah, it's the power of satire.
Yeah.
But in in the long run, if you don't have people mocking you a bit, you need to have people mocking you a bit or criticizing you or something. Otherwise, you sort of vanish into a weird world of conspiracies, which I think is where he's at. I mean, this essay he wrote last summer about, the oneness of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples. It's bonkers. Properly like crazy Facebook comments.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.